We are now moving on from sediments to sedimentary rocks, but we did have to start with sediments because that's what sedimentary rocks are made from. You can see in this picture here, this is a sedimentary rock, a cliff of it, and this is called a conglomerate because it's made of large pieces of sediment. So this is a solid rock. If you tried to hit this with a rock hammer, it would be solid. It wouldn't fall apart like sediment. This has been formed by taking pieces of gravel that were sediment and turning them into a solid rock. So we're going to talk about how that happens in this video and the next video. I have also put this picture in here showing a shale, which is a fine-grained sedimentary rock, with fossils of leaves. Fossils are very commonly preserved in sedimentary rocks, and they are extremely rare in metamorphic or igneous rocks. So if you have a rock with a fossil, 99% sure that it's a sedimentary rock. Here are the learning outcomes for Unit 8B. Go ahead and pause the video and write these down. So why study sedimentary rocks in the first place? Sedimentary rocks offer unique information compared to igneous rocks. They reflect the physical and chemical characteristics of their source environment. And so what that means is if the rock formed out in the deep marine ocean area, then we have information that tells us that, and then maybe we can get ancient information about ocean salinity or carbon dioxide levels. They contain direct and indirect evidence for life. Again, fossils. Here's a fossil of a bird. If you can tell, that's the beak. These are the arms, actually, that are attached then to the wings. Sedimentary rocks can be used to interpret Earth history. So, for example, this region used to be a lake, this region used to be a canyon, this region used to be below sea level. And then finally, fossil fuels are also formed in sedimentary environments. There are two ways that sedimentary rocks form, and that's because there are two types of sediment, if you recall. So we're going to link those together. The two terms that we tend to use are lithification, lith means rock, so rockification, and precipitation. Not the type of precipitation that's rain or snow, but the type of precipitation where something becomes solid in a solution. For example, if you take a big bucket of ocean water and you let it evaporate, there will be salts that precipitate on the bottom. That's what we mean by precipitation. So let's start with lithification. We have loose sediment like gravels. They get buried, compacted, and then cements, natural cements come in and cement all those grains together. Those cements can be calcite, they can be silica, they can be iron oxide. Precipitation, as I mentioned, is when ions that are dissolved in solution crystallize and become solid. And there's a number of ways that that can happen. The connection I want you to make here is that this process on top acts on sediments that were produced by physical weathering, so small pieces of rock. On the bottom here, the precipitation is produced from the results of chemical weathering. Remember, chemical weathering dissolves rocks in some cases and puts ions in solution. So precipitation takes those ions back out and produces a solid mineral or rock. Because of these two types of weathering, there are two types of sedimentary rocks. There are the clastic rocks, which are also called detrital sometimes. Clasts and detritus both mean little bits of pieces of sediment. And again, these are formed from the products of physical weathering. And so what I have here in this picture is sediment falling on the seafloor, and it, as you imagine, it just sort of piles up in layers. At first it's just sediment. You could dig this with a shovel if you had to, but eventually the weight of the overlying rocks are going to compact them, and they're going to be squeezed together, and then natural cements will come in and glue them together, basically. This is shown here in this little cartoon. We have compaction of sediments, and this blue indicates water. As they become more and more compacted, that water leaves, and we have very, very compacted sediment. Then some sort of natural cement comes in and glues all those grains together. So if we just had the grains compacted together, then when we brought it back to the surface, they would fall apart again. But when we have this natural cement, and that's what's shown by these blocky looking colors, that's going to cement the material together. There's a one-to-one correlation between different kinds of clastic sediment and the rock they produce. Muds, which are very fine-grained, produce shales. That's a sedimentary rock. And then we also have something called a siltstone. Silt is just a little bit larger than clay, and clay would be what we consider mud. Sand, remember sand is a size term, produces sandstone. And here's a picture of me at a very famous sandstone formation in Utah. In fact, this is on the license plates of Utah. This is called Delicate Arch. And yes, I am taking a phone call. This is from about 10 years ago. If somebody was standing over here, they'd be about as tall as that line there, that break. So this is a very large structure. It's very far in the distance behind me. But you can see the layers that indicate that it was once layered sediment. If we have gravel that becomes compacted and lithified, we get something called a conglomerate. And here's another picture of me. This is me sitting on a conglomerate over in the Devil's Punch Bowl, not far from Pasadena on the other side of the mountains. And this one has actually been tilted upright, but you can see these different layers that were originally formed by gravel accumulating on the Earth's surface. Here's another example showing the connection between the sediment and the rock. So this is a sand dune, and these are loose sediments of sand. If they become buried, compacted, cemented, and then brought back to the surface, they will look like this. This is basically fossilized sand dunes. This is in Zion National Park. A significant portion of the Earth's surface on land is covered with sedimentary rock. Remember, the oceans are all igneous. The second type of sedimentary rock is a result of the chemical weathering process. These are called chemical sedimentary rocks. And there's a number of processes that produce these. One of them is organisms. In the marine environment, oysters and clams and even corals, they make their house or their shell by taking calcium carbonate out of the water that's dissolved, ions, and building their shell. Here we have a bunch of shells that are made of something called limestone, and they're also in a mud, a limestone mud, and they have been cemented together. Here I'm showing the life cycle of an oyster, and the reason I'm showing it is to emphasize that these shellfish are not born with a shell. Okay, there's a stage where they have a larva stage, and then they eventually start to build their shell, and the older they are, the bigger the shell becomes. So again, they're taking ions out of the seawater and they're making their shell. Another way that chemical sedimentary rocks can form is from evaporation. And so this is the idea that I mentioned, where you could take a big bucket of seawater, let it evaporate, and you get salts left behind. And that's what's shown here. Sometimes we have inland basins that have connections to the sea when sea level is high. This would be like the Mediterranean Sea, actually. And so when the sea level is high, it brings in all this salty water, sea level drops, and then it evaporates, and the salts are left behind. Finally, we can precipitate chemical sedimentary rocks out of solution without the aid of any biological organism. And that has to do with how saturated the seawater is. Saturated liquids mean that they can't hold any more solid. If you have a glass of iced tea and you put in a spoon of sugar and you stir it and dissolve it, then your iced tea is undersaturated with respect to sugar. You could still dissolve more sugar if you needed to. Eventually, if you kept adding sugar, you're going to get to the point where no more sugar is actually going to dissolve. And that means that the iced tea has become saturated with respect to sugar. It can no longer hold sugar. And then if you had the right conditions and keep adding more sugar, you would actually grow additional sugar crystals. And this is what people commonly do when they grow rocks. They actually make supersaturated solutions, and those precipitate on a little string. So here's an example with a chemical rock called limestone. This is the most common sedimentary rock on Earth. And it's created in seawater, either from organisms like I showed you, or by this natural process. The shallow ocean is saturated, which means if organisms with calcite shells are living in this area, or they live at the surface and then they fall to depth, they're not going to dissolve because there's no more ability for the ocean to hold dissolved calcite. And so very commonly these accumulate on shallow regions of the ocean, such as mid-ocean ridges. But below a certain depth, called the calcite compensation depth, the seawater is undersaturated with respect to calcite, and so it would dissolve. So you wouldn't expect any calcite below a certain depth, which is, in this case, a little more than 4,000 meters or 4 kilometers below sea level. Now we can preserve calcium carbonate if it's buried quickly by something else and then doesn't have a chance to dissolve. A lot of chemical sedimentary rocks are formed this way. Also shown here is silica, which is another type of shell that little microscopic organisms make. Ocean water is oversaturated when it comes to silica. So silica does not dissolve as it goes down to deeper areas. It stays solid, and sometimes it's that silica that covers up the calcite. So coming up next, you're going to watch a video from the City College of San Francisco about sedimentary rock identification.